And I think the message is, listen, you don't have to do it all by age 35 or 40, the way many of them are thinking. There's a huge amount of pressure in Q2 to accomplish and achieve multiple things, almost all of them in your 30s or early 40s, which is why that happiness curve of life that people talk about dips in the 30s and 40s, because there's too much pressure. And then we now see it in the burnout rates and the mental health issues of youngsters. So I hope one of the big messages is pace yourself in Q2 with the knowledge that really Q2 are the building blocks and foundation of what might be your most impactful years and decades, which can happen now in Q3.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the professional world by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, who advocates for new thinking in generational and gender balance. She's a consultant, coach, and speaker who advises on the rising impact of longevity on people and on the workplace, and provides advice to help businesses thrive. She's the author of 7 books on gender, leadership, and longevity, and the host of the podcast 4 Quarter Lives, where she applauds podcasts as a way to create real conversations in a very noisy world. I'm looking forward to this real conversation here. Welcome, Avivah. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. Lovely to be here.
Well, let's start with your background and career journey. Where did you grow up? What did you study? And what brought you to this multifaceted career as a speaker, coach, and consultant?
Well, at our advanced ages, we now have so many careers in our lifespan that it's kind of hard to give a quick summary, but I started out in Canada of a French mother and a Swiss father, so a very European background, and my mother tongue is French, although it doesn't sound like that now. And I studied in university computer science and comparative literature, which is a pretty good indication of my either totally disjointed personality or interest in building bridges across areas that don't usually talk to each other. So I'm always quite interested in what I usually summarize it as words, numbers, and people. I like a lot of data. I like a lot of proof. I like writing, and I like working with a lot of people. And I've been a coach for about 20 years. And so all the careers I've kind of played with have revolved around these 3 interests and skills. I've also done an MBA, INSEAD, way back in the early days after I went as a way of pivoting from technology into more management consulting kind of roles. An early company I had worked for a decade on corporate communications of all kinds, which was a lot of writing and speaking and helping other people write and speak. I was based in Paris for a long time, so I spent a lot of time working with companies who were either going internationally out from France or American companies, North American companies moving into Europe. So kind of bilingual stance there. And then I got into sort of my main first half career, which was working to gender balance the business world for the last 20 years, which I got into through a nonprofit. I started a volunteer network when I became a mother for the second time, and I wanted to figure out how to balance work and personal life and family. And this grew into one of Europe's biggest professional women's network that still exists today as Global PWN. And from there, I really learned a lot about this whole gender issue, what women needed, how the work world was designed. And that led me to create my current company in 2005 called 21st, which has worked really on 3 issues: nationality balance, gender balance, and increasingly in the last few years, generational balance. And these are kind of the big demographic and market issues of our time: globalization, the rise of women, and increasingly the rise and strength of the old.
Well, we're going to dig into each of those, and fascinating background there. The first question I'd love to ask is around studying comparative literature, because I love to go back into people's original focuses, because I do think that you learn, I'm sure, a great deal from a degree like that, particularly one that also has a language component of computers, computer science and computer languages. Did you find you took away any skills or insights from a comparative literature degree into, say, the universality of some of these problems that we're facing and trying to tackle?
Well, I think I learned many, many things from that early degree. I think one, that I was taking 2 degrees, kind of computer science on the one hand, which sure as hell didn't talk to the comparative literature people on the other, and that there was this really big separation between people interested in literature and people interested in the sciences, which I thought was an initial shame. I am very influenced, of course, by the fact that my father was a mathematician and my mother was a literary professor. So I really fused the interest of the two. And what you learn from comparative literature and from this issue with computer science is people are really different. And when you read literatures from around the world and from different cultures, you get a really early and deep understanding that different cultures have very, very different ways of seeing the world, and that truth is very relative. And I think that's only anchored by working across the sciences and literature. You also see that people have very different perspectives of what the rules are, what value is, what morality is, depending what side of those divides you're on. So it was something I'm still learning, is just how rich the differences are and how do we build bridges across them.
And then before we launch into how you went about tackling this problem, you said your objective was to balance the gender imbalance in the business world, not exactly a small undertaking. How do you approach something that could be seen as enormous, intractable, unfixable? How did you go about tackling that?
With humility. I think the issue in tackling these huge issues is you're not going to solve them alone. You're going to bring your particular background, knowledge, and network to the shift that you want to do. Since I had kind of by, circumstance done an MBA and gotten started in the business world, which certainly wasn't my family background or my educational background, really, I thought, okay, I have this business platform. Gender is an issue in all strains of life in my lifetime. We are kind of the tipping point generation where women became the majority of the educated talent and most of the management coming into a lot of organizations. So I thought I'd use that base. I also thought that business would be faster changing than many other places. So it became for me a bit of a laboratory. If I could work with, and I did, some of the most progressive companies in the world who are really early adopters of, yes, let's leverage the skills of women and gender balance our organizations, that would create role modeling for other companies and for other organizations and even countries to do the same. And since I've never been of a particular country, like I don't really belong anywhere, I didn't feel very relevant to any particular cultural frame.
Well, I'm also an INSEAD graduate, so great to have another one here. And I will say that was another huge eye-opening moment for me, was the relevance of the organizational behavior piece. Coming in with the hard skills was one thing, but just that veil being lifted on the importance of the other side. I wouldn't even say the word softer skills because that probably minimizes them, but it was a real revelation. So I'd love to move now to talk about your work and some of the concepts that you've breathed life into through the work. And the first is the 4 quarters in life, this rubric. Tell us about that. And does this apply to everyone?
Well, I got kind of an electroshock during the pandemic when I was stuck in a little barn in Somerset for a couple of years. And I did a lot of reading. And I was also approaching 60, which is always a good moment to be thinking about aging. And I read a book by Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott, 2 London Business School professors, called The 100-Year Life. I think it's impacted a lot of people. It created a lot of ripples. And I thought, oh my God, this is the next big thing. It was really very obvious to me. It reminded me a lot of the whole gender issue, the rise of women, how that was often misframed and underestimated. And here was this massive increase in the demographic shapes of countries. Basically, we're moving a world that was used to pyramids, demographic pyramids with a few old people and a lot of young people, to these much more generationally balanced squares with about the same number of older and younger for the first time in human history. I mean, this is like so big And like gender, it's like so mind-blowingly large, global, and hits every country and every company and every couple. And I found, just like I did with the gender issue, it's just not being talked about that way or even framed that way. So I picked up, my goal is not really to do deep science or research in the academy. It's much more to use the kind of insights that these people bring, like this 100-Year Life book, and translate a bridge build to a much more mass audience. And so that's where the 4-quarter life came, is, so how do you digest the idea of 100-year life? My goal was to turn it into kind of business language. The business world is very familiar with quarters. We spend our lives talking about Q1 and Q2. Have you achieved your goals? Did you spend your budget? Are you ready for Q3? How's the end of the year, Q4, looking? I thought it was a great metaphor for life, right? How are we doing? 100-year lives would split into neat 25-year quarters. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, a big part of the message I was trying to communicate, since I work in the business world, was essentially that the really new thing in our longer lives is actually this quarter that I call Q3, the third quarter, these 25 years after 50, that used to be a time of slowing down in retirement. And now with this generation that you and I are obviously a part of, is very different from the way our parents lived this phase, which is a blossoming, a time affluence time, a time of greater health, activity, and interest and engagement in the world. And so there was this massive opportunity to get people to realize they're going to live and work longer than generations that died earlier. And what would we like to do with this Q3? We're often in a stronger, slightly more secure position, both internally in our brains and externally in the world. What do we want to do with that time? How can we use it? And how can we give forward some of the knowledge and experience that we've used? And the other big piece of my 4-quarter model is the work world as it stands today is designed for Q2ers. It's designed for short sprints, careers that start at 25 and pretty much end at 50, unless you're of the very few that kind of make it to the top and stay on for a bit longer. The corporate world's pretty good at nudging out the 50 plus, or has been, and that just doesn't work anymore in a world where our demographics are reshaping. There won't be enough young people for our economies. And so getting the work world to extend from Q2 out through Q3, which is the same size, right? We're doubling the scope of people's working lives into these long 50 or 60-year marathons. It's going to take quite a lot of adjustment of mindsets, management competencies, and corporate systems generally, just as, I keep saying, just as it required shifting from a very male-focused, male-dominated design to a much more gender-balanced one. So we've gone from gender balance to generational balance, and it'll take a bit of time to get those 4 quarters embedded.
I love that concept. And I know we both know Catherine Foote, and she actually has a lovely anecdote in her podcast, which she did last year, around the idea of thinking like you've written a play, and you've been told you need to add an extra 20 minutes or half an hour to the length of the play. What would you do then to the play? Would you just repeat the same story that you've been doing? Or would you think about maybe staging it differently, staggering it differently? And when you start thinking about a life, not only as 100 years, but as having these 4 quarters, how do you think about maybe thinking about your early Q3 and how to plan that? Any sort of tangible differences in mindset?
Yeah, I think it's huge. So you and I are both of a generation, particularly of women, who were stuck in the old mindset of these kind of 3-phase life. You study, you work, and then you retire. And so our idea of life and the way we tried to balance out work and family and all the other things we were trying to do was to delay some of the adulting, as the young folk call it these days, of Q2 as late as possible. So we got married later and later and later. That trend is still going on. We had children later and later and later, well into our 30s. And then we tried to balance the whole thing out at a slightly later age, which was not always very obvious or easy. And sometimes we got hooked in the corporate systems that weren't adjusted to that. So I think the opportunity of this longer 4-quarter life and the existence of Q3 is for Q2ers to take a bit more time to do some of the things that we didn't take much time to do. Have kids when you want them, pause maybe a little bit more or plateau. I'm not suggesting you drop out, but that parents can take a little bit more breathing space. Right now, they think that, and there's so much media around having a kid costs you $1 million in career net present value, and people aren't having kids anymore despite wanting them. And I think the message is, listen, you don't have to do it all by age 35 or 40, the way many of them are thinking. There's a huge amount of pressure in Q2 to accomplish and achieve multiple things, almost all of them in your 30s or early 40s, which is why that happiness curve of life that people talk about dips in the 30s and 40s, because there's too much pressure. And then we now see it in the burnout rates and the mental health issues of youngsters. So I hope one of the big messages is pace yourself in Q2 with the knowledge that really Q2 are the building blocks and foundation of what might be your most impactful years and decades, which can happen now in Q3.
That's brilliant. And now we see the link between women's careers, perhaps, and the 100-year life, and thinking about that. So thinking about Q3, so by your estimate of 25 years per quarter, that's between the ages of 50 and 75. How well equipped do you think workplaces are today to cater for that segment, that demographic, to truly include them? And I think I've spoken a lot on previous series about some of the unhelpful biases in place and the fact of ageism, the fact that it's almost tolerated in plain sight, although never explicitly so. How do you think businesses need to adapt?
Profoundly, like they had to adapt to women, right? It's a whole other thing. Again, it's not just ageism. I mean, that's not the most constructive frame with which to walk into organizations and say it's time to change, just like it wasn't very helpful to yell about sexism and try and change companies, right? It's like, this is huge. This is a massive business opportunity. If you wake up to the demographic realities of 21st century talent and markets and consumers, there will be new needs, new services, new opportunities, and new ways of managing careers over much longer timeframes, which means they shouldn't be quite so vertical and linear and unbroken the way they were for the sprints when they were left in Q2. Now we can have, more time for lateral moves, for going in and out, for taking sabbaticals, for lifelong learning, all these things we've been talking about for quite a while. But now in an age of increasingly fast-changing technology and AI, we're going to have to spend much more time. I think the things humans will now have to spend more time on right from the beginning is health. We're going to have to invest in living longer and more healthily and learn how to eat and exercise and sleep right from early on, not later. And we're going to have to learn how to learn all the time. Not once in a blue moon if we go back for an exec ed program, but how are we going to embed learning into everything we do at every age without stopping until we die?
How about coaching? What role does coaching play in this? Because I think, this third quarter for women in particular also coincides with menopause. So there could be some hormonal changes perhaps, or just general changes that affect one's confidence levels or otherwise. And regardless of that, I think coaching should actually play a role much earlier in career in order to think about this plotting. Tell me about coaching and how maybe that can be integrated into any career.
Well, I think actually I would rather than thinking of coaching as something we layer on, I think increasingly what we have seen is the evolution of management itself integrate coaching as a style of management and leadership that generalizes it so that your people managers will always be a little bit also your coach, and they will be skilled. I'm being a little idealistic here. They will be skilled in some of these issues. And I have been spending most of my career creating what I call gender bilingual managers, right? Managers able to understand gender differences enough to accompany them, support their teams and their careers and their consumers by knowing what they need at different life stages and ages. If they're men, if they're women, if they're parents, if they're not, if they've got aging parents or not. There's so many issues that have to be integrated that I think throwing a coach as a layering on top is nice, but far more useful is if managers and the systems in organizations that they rely on to manage people have adjusted to this new reality. And I just add that, yes, of course, Q3 has not only physical changes, and it has not only physical changes for women, men change too. We spend so much time talking about menopause, much less about andropause. Guys age too. A lot of them have prostate issues. We never talk about that. So there are other taboos I think it's time to make. I don't think we should just focus this as women have all these issues and men have none. I don't think that's a great service to women, by the way. And I think, yeah, the workplace will need to be skilled in keeping everybody healthy, active, and engaged, or accompany them if they need a little bit of time to flexibilize through some of the shifts, of which the physical one is only one, right? There's motivational changes, emotional changes, and of course the life course, right? You have children leaving, you have parents getting old and aging, and we know that whoever you are, you're usually often caring for somebody in crisis moments at different points in life, and employers who don't factor that in and managers who don't know how to manage those moments are going to lose a lot of people.
Excellent points about the universality of change in Q3, and in fact, throughout one's life, but particularly maybe so notable in Q3. And I suppose the flip side of not layering in coaching, if it is integrated and if managers can include that in their style, is I think also an advocacy for self that is needed. You're not expecting a coach to fix it all. You have to, in a sense, take control a little bit of that journey. How would you recommend that people think about that?
I do a lot of work with individuals on these ideas of 4 quarters. And I think one of the skills we need to build is awareness of the 100-year life, awareness of these longer lives and careers, and then some ability to navigate transitions a little bit more calmly and resourcefully. Right now, this move from Q2 to Q3 is very under-institutionalized. There's no degree that you can go and do. Very few schools offer programs for people to stay engaged and gear up and accelerate into their 50s and 60s, right? You can take a few classes on how to develop a hobby, but what we really need is upskilling in order to stay employed, which is what a lot of people are going to need to do. So preparing individuals for that is part of the work that more and more coaches are moving into. So I think there are more and more midlife transition coaches. There's the emergence of midlife transition programs, and a number of companies and universities have started. I did a year at Harvard that was called the Advanced Leadership Initiative, which is very much this transition year. Others have started. Stanford, Oxford is adding in programs. So I think we're going to see this come into play more and more to accompany people through natural life transitions, but also much more frequent professional transitions. We will change careers more often in the future than we have in the past. And knowing how to do that, and I have a whole course on what are the skills you need in order to transition, how do you prepare, how do you muscle up for this marathon of these new career shapes. Yeah, we all have to get skilled at being really good transitionists. That's going to be the new 21st century management skill.
That's a fascinating concept. And I think also it's funny how we started this discussion reflecting on COVID and maybe a change that forced you to make. I do think COVID and it's the uncertainty it plunged us all into, forced, as well as the stress and the health concerns and anxiety, etc. All of these kind of came to the fore at once. But I think learning how to manage anxiety is a key part of managing transitions. Learning how to get comfortable with uncertainty, too, is a key part of managing transitions because it is all around us. A lot of people are not comfortable with it. It's rare to be comfortable with it, but I think that may have to be a factor in how we approach this next phase is not being able to predict. We don't know which of us won't maybe be lucky enough to have that fourth quarter. Health is always a concern. Maybe a spouse or a loved one will have an uncertain event like that. So all these skills, I think, are an important part of the toolkit as you look to planning.
Navigating what's being called the never normal phase is going to require new skills, but I also think that's one of the opportunities of sort of intergenerationality. For the moment, we live life mostly siloed by age. And I think the older who've been through a few cycles and crises in their life are actually a little calmer and a little less anxious than some of the youngsters who have these enormous things that they don't know how to navigate. Of course not. And I think if we were better connected across generations, we'd also be better equipped in companies, but also politically, to invent and innovate our way through some of the massive challenges that are facing us, whether it's a green revolution, a digital revolution, or this longevity revolution. We've got huge challenges, and I don't think we're going to be able to solve them without better idea generation across different ages.
I love that reflection on the benefit of intergenerational groups. Really, I also think it's key for contributing resilience into younger generations to hear from older generations as to how they've overcome, I think is an important piece. Speaking of reflections and overcoming, have there been any highs or lows of your career that you can reflect on, maybe learning lessons from?
I've almost always worked for myself. And I think I've worked for myself in what might be called lifestyle entrepreneurship rather than growth entrepreneurship. And so I think a lot of what entrepreneurs learn early on with their early experiences is they have a very different approach to failure or downs. I always just find you're constantly working on ideas or interests, some of which pan out and some of which don't. So you're almost naturally in what now has become known as design thinking. You have ideas, you market test them, some of them take off, and generally by the time you do something for a little while, you get a little bored and you're thinking from a position of relative accomplishment. What would you do next? Like, what's the next thing that's happening in the world that might require your skills or your contribution? And I think that's kind of the shape of my career. I've gone through a series of arcs working on a variety of topics. And if I look back, were there ups and downs? There was more natural, like a plant or a tree goes towards sun, right? There were some things that just ended up not growing, and they were shelved and put on the back burner. And others, you navigate your way through towards what feels a little bit sunnier and more welcoming. But I'd also say, listen, I'm always a little bit ahead of curves, like not too far ahead, but a little bit ahead. So the initial few years of most of what I do, nobody wants, like I've always spent my life, I wish I was of this ilk, but I've always spent my life mostly selling things people don't really want for quite some time. And so the hard part of this is kind of slogging a little bit alone in the wind until things catch up, and then you're carried off on a current that you partly created or contributed to.
And given your wealth of connections and the work you do, the people you've coached, the articles you've written, the feedback you've received, is there any word of wisdom or gem that you can leave us with in terms of something maybe that you wish your younger self had known or that you think we can take with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, I've always been surrounded by people at least 10 years older than me. I find them incredibly useful. But then I think the biggest piece of advice I give, and I really don't give much advice because I don't think it's necessarily always very useful, is listen to as many people as you can, experience as many things as you can, take it all in. But in the end, don't listen to anybody except what your own deep intuition, because nobody else is in your shoes with your motivations, your background, your personality, that whole snowflake thing. And so you have to take in lots and lots, as much as you possibly can. There's always nuggets to be gleaned, but don't ever listen to what anybody tells you. That's a real imposition. And it's kind of the opposite of coaching, right? Coaching is always much more about dragging out what's really needs coming out from deep, deep inside you.
I love that. Well, as somebody with, I think, to the day, 5 months left in Q2, I am so excited to hear about the prospect of Q3 and Q4, and to thank you for the wisdom of plotting that out as to what it may look like and thinking ahead as to how we should think ahead as to what our careers look like. The idea of having these long, exciting, varied careers is such an empowering and exciting one. So thank you for coming here and sharing these insights with us.
My pleasure. And the earlier you know about Q3, the better able you are to run at it properly.
Well, we look forward to doing that and watching you continue to do that.
Thanks, Aoife.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring professionals and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.